Right, the guys over at GEEKOM have reached out again, and this time I've got another mini PC. Now, these are going on sale because they've got their 22nd anniversary going on. I believe this is their GEEKOM A8 range with the R7 chip from AMD. So they're going to be having these on sale for a little while, and honestly, they seem pretty good value, and they've asked me to take a little look at them. So I've got tons of testing in mind because I love testing these modern APUs, and I just love these little mini PCs. So why don't we go ahead and get this open and see what all the fuss is about. Well, we have a box in a box, so why don't we go ahead and get this box open. I can't say I've ever had any problems with their packaging. All of them have always arrived in perfect condition. And it is the GEEKOM A8 mini PC gaming desktop computer. Given the specs of the A6 we've already looked at, that certainly was a bit of a gaming powerhouse. In fact, I've still got it in use. So here we have it, the GEEKOM A series. I'd always love their boxes, don't want to damage anything. I've got like a nice collection of these boxes going on now. So we do actually have the specs on here. So this has got the Ryzen 7 8745HS with 32 gigs of DDR5. Now, I've just come from testing a Core 2 Duo, so this is going to seem like another realm of power compared to what I've been used to the last week. The big reveal. So we've got our mini PC here. Quality build, 2 USB 3 ports, headphones, dual HDMI, dual USB-C, Ethernet, 2 more USBs, power, and of course the SD card reader. And that is minuscule. This is probably more powerful than most things we test on the channel, and it's smaller than my phone. That really is minuscule. So this is the Ryzen 7 version, but you can also get a Ryzen 9 from when I was taking a look at their website. And once again, they've just said, do whatever with it. So that's why I kind of enjoy working with them, because I get these, and I've got a lot of testing planned for that little Ryzen chip in there. So what else do we get inside the box? We've got our little instruction manual, UK power adapter, which I cannot explain how nice that is to actually get a UK plug, HDMI, and of course, in standard GEEKOM fashion, base mount. So you can put this wherever you want. But let's get this all plugged in and take a little look at how it's actually working. Now, we'll start by using a 1080p monitor, but if it comes to it, we will just move to a 1440p monitor, because given the Ryzen 7 chip in here, I'm actually a little bit curious what the graphics chip in here is, but I'd imagine it can do much more than 1080p. It also looks comically small placed down on the desk like that. God, it certainly makes filming a lot easier when you're filming something that doesn't take up about half the desk. So just to discuss pricing real quick, because it is their 22nd anniversary, these are on sale for about $460, around that price point. If you go on the website, they're running an anniversary sale. You ain't gonna get me complaining about an anniversary sale, because that works out probably pretty good value for a whole Ryzen system. But we're gonna be running it through all the paces, and I am going to include some Linux testing, if all goes well, because one thing that everyone always asks me to test with these little mini PCs and their APUs is, can you test just how they perform under Linux? Because I can understand that with, the AMD Mesa Vulkan drivers and everything like that, they probably work really well. Right, let's turn this on and see what it's like. Silent, to be expected. So I've actually had the GEEKOM A6, which had the AMD 680M chip in it, for around 8 months now. That's how long I've been using it for. And I've got to say, it's been faultless, because my brother's the one that actually uses it, and he uses it non-stop. That thing gets used from the moment he's in from work through till whenever he goes to sleep. That is how much use that GEEKOM chip gets. It's been faultless. Every single thing he's wanted to play on it has just worked absolutely fine. So maybe he'll be getting this one as an upgrade. Maybe I'll be using this one myself. You see how quick it is to use out of the box, because one of my favorite tests to do on these is to just brute force a ton of applications through them, through multiple USB interfaces, just to make sure that it keeps up with everything. I have no doubt, given the processor in this, that it'll handle it absolutely fine, but you never know. Sometimes it's worth making them just really work and put them through their paces. Right, so if we go ahead and get this plugged in as well, what we're going to try and do is just really stress things out if we can. So real quick, just what are the specifications of the PC? We've got the Ryzen 7 8745HS with the Radeon 780M chip. Now that 780M chip I am very curious about. I've not yet dabbled around with the 780M. I believe last time we looked at one of these it had the 680M chip, so we're an entire generation up from that now. From what I've tested of AMD's APUs and the iGPU technology, I mean, I was blown away by when they had the AMD Ryzen 200 GE come out, if anyone remembers when that came out. But the technology increased between then and now. Just the performance is just phenomenal. It's fantastic. So we'll go ahead and get this set up. We go through here. Let's get Crysis installed, because we have to test Crysis, don't we? It's very important that we test Crysis. I'm going to install probably a classic game on here, so why don't we go with something like SimCity 4 just to test backwards compatibility with older titles. And then if we go really old school and go with Unreal Gold as well, just so we've got a few titles on here that are of the older sort, it's really not struggling at all. I'd imagine they're still using the excellent wireless adapters that we've tested on all previous models, because even their lower end ones have just got much better wireless chips than even my dedicated adapters. What else do we need? Let's get Afterburner. Yeah, coming from the Core 2 Duo to this really does make me appreciate just how far we've come, because I am doing so much on the system right now, and there's just no slowdown. There's the tiniest little bit of fan noise, the most minuscule little bit. So in about, what were we looking at the time? About 3 minutes, we've gone from an empty Windows install to nearly everything we need for testing. It just handles it fine. It's why I use one. It's why I literally just now have a laptop and a mini PC, because it's probably one of the reasons why they like me actually using these, because at least I'm actually going to use what they send me, and I can report back if I've had any problems. But I can't say that on any of the GEEKOM PCs they've sent me, even in the last year or so after constant use, they're bang up fine. They just seem to handle everything okay. When I'm doing my uses on a PC, I'm tending to be quite the heavy user with multitasking, rendering. Well, when I'm doing rendering, chances are I'm doing it in the brilliant editor Serif Movie Plus X6, which is purely CPU bound. This is a really brutal test for processor usage. So don't worry, we'll get some editing tests in there, we'll get some AI tests, we'll get a bit of everything on here. If we get OBS as well, that'd be a good test to do, just to get some recording performance, because, I mean, tons of people getting into streaming. What if all you really need is this? Right, there's our information about the graphics card. So as we can see there, it is the Radeon 780M 4nm, released in January of 2023, and we've got DDR5 with 4 gigs allocated, but with how modern Windows works. And then within no time at all, we've already got drivers downloading, all the programs installed, Steam updating, and the PC all ready to go. And that has taken, in real terms, 10 minutes out of the box. I wish it was that fast on a Core 2 Duo, but these things tend to be a lot quicker. Now, it goes without saying that on the GEEKOM A8, with that AMD Ryzen processor that's inside, general usage, as you've already just seen, really isn't a problem. I tried multitasking with different applications running, game installers, driver installers, absolutely everything under the sun, and it just doesn't slow down. A lot of the time it still is cores free, and a lot of the time it refuses to even boost up unless you are really stressing out one or two of those cores with an old installer that can only utilize a couple of cores. So when it comes to general usage and day-to-day tasks, well, the PC was more or less absolutely fine. I will say the boosting was particularly useful when it came to installing a lot of those older applications, as Unreal Gold, for example, installed in what must have been about 15 to 30 seconds. Crysis was done in about 2-3 minutes, and even Serif Movie Plus, which is an old installer, well, that was also done in well under a minute, including the QuickTime installer it comes bundled with. So internet browsing, video usage, generally just using it as a PC, not a problem. It hardly even does anything at all to stress out the system, so unless you're going to be running quite a few high-end applications at once, seeing any slowdown on a system like this with a Ryzen-based processor like that, well, you really aren't going to be getting any slowdown. I know it's quite a boring segment to talk about general usage, but it is always something worth talking about, because as some hardware moves on and new hardware releases, the modern web gets harder and is just something that's worth testing. When it comes to modern hardware, yeah, sure, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's always something worth recapping about. Just as a refresher on the specifications, as we only really covered it in the live segment setting it all up, this is the GEEKOM A8 mini PC featuring the AMD Ryzen 7 8745HS chip, which is 8 cores and 16 threads at 3.8 GHz, but from my testing, it will boost up to 4.939 GHz when you're actually putting some real load on things, so you're seeing nearly 5 GHz out of this mini PC's processor in places. It's got 32GB of DDR5 RAM, which comes in very handy for powering the iGPU, which is a very interesting Radeon 780M chip.
It comes in with Windows 11 installed, was built in 2025, and has 1TB of NVMe storage. Now this unit is one of the cheaper variants and is on sale for $469 when I last checked the website, which does mean you are getting an awful lot of power for the money. But on the topic of that graphics chip, as that is something I'm really curious about testing, it even boasts some rather good specifications by itself. It comes in based on Radeon A3, utilising the Phoenix version of the architecture, which is actually on the 4nm node, which just sounds exceptionally modern for most things that I actually test. So it's part of the Navi 3 generation to try and put things into perspective. It came out in sort of early 2023 and utilises 768 cores, 48 TMUs and 32 ROPs. Its memory, of course, is dependent on the system you have it in. So in our case, it has some really rather speedy DDR5 memory, which, trust me, really does actually help things, and I've done some benchmarking just to show that it does actually benefit the performance. So that's the system we've got on test today. All that's left to do is to test the system. Now, to get some of the benchmarks going, I have gone through and tested the performance in 3D Mark to try and get a ballpark figure of what type of graphical performance we can get out of what is a budget mini PC system utilising an iGPU. Well, in Firestrike, which is a DirectX 11 test, we saw 8,567, moving on to a DirectX 12 test with TimeSpy, and we saw 2,964, and then moving it on even further with Speedway, which is a DirectX 12 ray tracing test, we saw a score of 454. Now, as you look at these scores, you probably think, well, that's quite the steep drop off a cliff. Well, that tends to be what happens with 3D Mark. As it iterates and gets more intensive, the score will drop, because if you throw in CloudGate, which is a DirectX 10 test, well, there's a reason I decided to omit it from the original graph, because we saw over 53,000 in score. So in terms of graphical performance out of the box, it really isn't too bad. It tends to be competing with older Nvidia or AMD flagships, and to actually get some comparison results, I did run TimeSpy across a few graphics cards just to try and place the performance. Because DirectX 12 is a modern API and we can still test a lot of graphics cards on it. Older flagships like the Nvidia GTX 480 are completely obliterated, but it's not quite as powerful as some cards like the RX 480 or even AMD's R9 Fury, but then again, those were some quite powerful cards when they came out, and it's still nice to see that it is at least getting close to them for an iGPU. In terms of real-world performance, it's scoring above an AMD Radeon HD 7970 and a GTX 780. So what you are seeing is pretty much older flagship performance from both AMD and Nvidia being matched by AMD's, even now, a couple of year old APU chip. And we've tested those cards before and had some really good experiences, so we're essentially taking that flagship power and cramming it down into a minuscule power envelope. When it comes to actually comparing the ray tracing performance, well, you can tell this is new to this channel, because in terms of actual ray tracing benchmarks, I have one other result, which is the RTX 4010, which is a card you can't even really buy. But we saw over double the performance of that card, and that was really quite an impressive chip, and also something that's got comparable TDP. So there we have it for the 3D Mark results. It seems pretty promising, matching some older flagships. Now, before we get into the benchmarks, because trust me, I've got a bit carried away, as I always do with these new mini PCs and these APUs. I love testing the performance on them just to try and place and gauge how they're doing across brand new titles, the most popular titles out there, and even some older classics to test how it handles older APIs and older games. But before we jumped into the benchmarks, I did go into the BIOS and increase the VRAM limit on the card. This is something I do really recommend doing, as even just bumping it up to 8GB really does tend to help the system. For some reason on some PCs it seems fine and Windows deals with it okay, but in this instance it really did benefit me jumping it up to 8GB. There was no change in 3D Mark, but when it came to actual gaming benchmarks, just having that dedicated VRAM buffer being slightly larger did help things here. So with all of that out of the way, just how does this GEEKOM A8 mini PC, and by extension AMD's Radeon 780M, because that is really what we're testing here, the CPU side of things, that can handle absolutely everything, and I do have some CPU tests later on in the video, but for now, most of the performance we're seeing here is very much down to AMD's tiny, power-efficient and minuscule Radeon 780M in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmark, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with a mixture of high and very high settings, and also the ray tracing enabled on the high options, and this was in a 1080p resolution. Now, we did have to lock the frame rate to 30 FPS, which guaranteed us a perfectly smooth experience, as uncapping the frame rate wasn't a bad experience, but led to some odd frame pacing quirks that just weren't present with the frame rate capped. Now, if you disabled ray tracing, you could easily see 60 FPS with very similar settings, but for the sake of actually testing the ray tracing component of this mini PC, I thought, you know what, we're gonna leave it on, because the ray tracing in this game does actually look really rather decent, and is actually surprisingly well optimized given how good it looks. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition worked perfectly fine with a locked 30 FPS, very rarely dropping away from this figure. Moving back a little bit to the legacy version of the game though, where we are running the game with very high settings in a 1080p resolution, and we saw 67 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 63 FPS. So when it comes to the older version of GTA 5, well, even when you're using DirectX 11, this APU handles it absolutely fine. Honestly, if you didn't mind actually targeting a slightly lower frame rate, you could have turned this game up to ultra settings with all of the advanced options turned on. But for the sake of maintaining a 60 FPS experience, I thought, you know what, we're going to leave things where they are, and it actually looked fairly decent. We did have AMD's CHS shadows turned on, but that's a given that we're using an AMD APU, and they do look remarkably decent in this game. So GTA 5 Legacy version, fully playable in 1080p with 60 FPS. Moving over to the world of GTA Online, we were still able to maintain our very high settings in 1080p, but honestly, for the sake of frame pacing, you'd be probably better off capping the frame rate, or probably in most chances actually just dropping a few settings, because the utilization here wasn't perfect. Now, this is something that is very much dependent on a game-to-game and card-to-card basis when it comes to the online version, as we've seen it perform absolutely fine on cards it shouldn't, and we've seen utilization problems on cards that should work absolutely fine. Performance here, before I'm complaining too much, was pretty decent, so I can't really complain about 56 FPS on average, but those 1% lows could have been better. Now, this wasn't all the time, and it wasn't present in smaller lobbies, only larger ones. So GTA Online was playable, but if you're going to be playing larger lobbies, maybe cap that frame rate or drop some settings. Next up, with a very popular title with BeamNG, which we ran with predominantly high settings, utilising our jungle benchmark map. Now, even in the 1080p resolution, we saw 39 FPS on average, and really decent frame times as well. Now, this of course is helped by the fact that we do have the amazing Ryzen Processor in here that can just boost up whenever required for those quite intensive single-core tasks that can go on in such a physics-based game. So BeamNG was completely playable, even in our most intensive stress test, and there really wasn't much you could do to shake the frame rate away from this. So I'm going to call this probably one of the best experiences I've had with BeamNG in recent times, and one that I'd be quite happy playing no matter what I was doing. But after so much positivity, there does have to be something this system will struggle with, and Half-Life 2 RTX, well, we're still waiting on a graphics card that can run it with playable frame rates properly, as here on the AMD's small APU, well, things did struggle. Now, with low settings in 480p, we did see 16 FPS on average, which was controllable in certain places, but it's not exactly the most ideal experience in the world. This is with the game set as low as it will possibly go. You can't go any lower than this, not realistically. So Half-Life 2 RTX wasn't all too playable, but then again, we've very rarely tested a system that it will work on. I mean, even an RTX 2080 Super was struggling with this game. With Cyberpunk 2077, we were able to run the game with the medium preset that also includes a few high settings in there, and this was all in a 1080p resolution. There was no need to use FSR or XeSS or any upscaling technology here. We are seeing a fully native 1080p image. We did have to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS, as it wasn't so much of a problem in the benchmark, but in-game we could run into some performance problems that would mostly just be hitching related, and it was just due to the graphics card trying too hard when too much was going on. With the frame rate capped, we have no problems whatsoever. Although the 1% low figures, I must admit I am lying slightly by rounding them up to 30 FPS, because the actual 1% low figures was 29.89. So it's close enough to round it up. We pretty much didn't drop a single frame. So Cyberpunk 2077 was miraculously completely playable on the system with no slowdown or problems. Just to see how the system deals with source games, we have Black Mesa here running with ultra settings. Now at first we were utilising the Vulkan renderer, but it just wasn't all too happy on the system. I tried capping the frame rate, I tried a few other options, and it just wasn't happy running here. So we did drop things back to DirectX 9. Now, I know what some people are thinking, a source game being intensive, trust me, when you get through to these Zen stages, they just look absolutely gorgeous for a source engine game. They are very intensive to run. I have seen even RTX 2080 cards and things like that struggle to maintain a playable frame rate here. But we were able to maintain a locked 60 FPS through a lot of this portion of the game, with only a few frame drops here or there. That is how intensive this is. Even this system that can play GTA 5 with ray tracing is going to struggle in Black Mesa's Zen section. But it looked great and it was very playable, but you had to be running DirectX 9 and have the frame rate capped at 60 to get the most optimal experience. Counter-Strike 2 was a game that I initially decided to run with high settings in 1080p, and admittedly we did see a fully playable frame rate with 77 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 51 FPS. But the thing is, for a competitive game like this, ideally you do want a few more frames than this. So I did drop things back to our competitive settings, which features low everything and high shadows. And here we saw 142 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 113 FPS. Now it is worth noting that regardless of the settings you use, this benchmark map is incredibly intensive, so when you actually went into a real competitive game, you'd be closer to seeing the 200 FPS figure with these competitive settings, and closer to around the 100 FPS range utilising the high settings. Either way, it doesn't matter what situation you're in, utilising lower settings here will net you double the frame rate, so you're probably better off going with competitive options, and the game still looks pretty good as well. In terms of benchmarks that have been heavily requested in the comments section, we have Rust. And to be fair, I did look it up on the Steam leaderboard to see how many people are playing it, and it turns out there are hundreds of thousands of people playing Rust every day. I had no idea that it had such a resurgence in popularity. Either way, with medium settings in 1080p, we saw 33 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 27 FPS. Dropping to lower settings didn't really help the frame rate here, so I opted to just keep things on medium. It's also worth talking about that Rust has probably one of the most in-depth benchmarks available out of a lot of new games I've tested, and this is a game that's just been through so many revisions at this point that I didn't even know it had a benchmark built in. But we ran through all of that and saw 33 FPS on average, so I'd call that just about playable. Oblivion Remastered seems to have been the cutting off point for a lot of graphics cards I've tested. It seems to mark the end of their usability. But here, I will have to give the AMD APU credit, it was able to run the game. With a locked 30 FPS, it sorted a lot of the frame pacing issues out that were present, not so much when you were inside towns and cities, but just when you were out in the wilderness. I know you can change some engine settings, and it is something we've dabbled in before to try and fix this, but the point remains. We did get the game playable without modifying any game files. Now, we utilised primarily low and medium settings in 1080p, but we did have to enable FSR on medium to maintain a perfectly smooth frame rate when things got intensive. Either way, with these settings it did look really good, ray tracing was enabled, and I'd call this a fully playable experience. So no, you can't experience the highest of texture options and all that, but you can at least enjoy Oblivion Remastered with a few of the effects turned up and turned on. Another incredibly popular title here, and one that I wasn't expecting such good performance from. Now, utilising medium and a couple of high options with the DirectX 12 renderer, which did really help out with frame rate stability here, we saw PUBG fully playable with 44 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 39 FPS. And I think my most impressive takeaway from this was 1% lows that good in PUBG. I know the DirectX 12 renderer really does help out these AMD cards, especially with the frame rate and utilization of them, but it was just impressive to get such a smooth experience in PUBG, knowing this game has such notorious optimization woes. So PUBG is still very playable and is actually quite enjoyable on a small mini PC with a Radeon 780M. I did opt to run City Skylines 1 here rather than City Skylines 2, mostly from requests in the comments section and how much people love seeing this version of the game tested, and not so much the second one. And given the type of PC and the APU we've got on test today, I think it's quite a relevant game to test. But with very high settings in 1080p, the processor really wasn't struggling whatsoever. The graphics card on the other hand was taking quite a bit of a beating, with 43 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 38 FPS. Once again, being a city builder, a good test of its playability is just how much footage I get out of the system. And in this case, we have another 20 minutes more of city building to add on to these benchmarks, so I've likely sped it up and that's the version you're seeing. Mount & Blade Bannerlord defaulted to running with high settings, so I thought, you know what, usually this game is pretty good at detecting what settings it likes to run with. And once again, it's proven itself right, as it ran with 60 FPS here on the GEEKOM A8. So I'm not really surprised here, given how much power we've got on show, but given how intensive the mid-section of this large battle benchmark can get, it was nice to see that our frame rate was pretty much always guaranteed to be over 30 FPS. Now, it's worth noting that from a lot of the early to late game, you'll be seeing well over 60 FPS on a system like this, so Mount & Blade Bannerlord, the pinnacle of optimization, works perfectly fine on the 780M, and with high settings, well, it looks pretty damn good as well. Baldur's Gate 3 actually ran fairly decent with a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p. Now, you're probably better off capping the frame rate at 30, given that we never saw below this figure, and it'd probably offer you a smoother experience overall. Either that or drop the settings down to lower options and enjoy the game at 60 FPS. But given the type of title it is, I do think a bit of eye candy is in order, and the frame rate being at 60 FPS isn't pretty much a must in this title. Either way, 34 FPS on average, medium and high settings, using the Vulkan renderer, Baldur's Gate 3 seemed pretty much playable completely fine, so Baldur's Gate 3 gets a pass here. Just to see how it handles performance of older titles that can be very demanding with their ultra-high settings, we do have the reboot of Tomb Raider running in 1080p. Now, it is worth noting here, this is with TresFX and all of the fancy options turned on to try and give the game as much of a chance of stressing out the system as possible. Now, utilization here could be a tad sporadic in places, but it wasn't enough to be really noticeable, at least not in terms of changes to the frame rate, so I'm going to call Tomb Raider a fairly good experience. It also goes to show there's a decent chunk of backwards compatibility with AMD's older hardware and software, so when it comes to things like TresFX actually working on your graphics card, there were no problems here and the game looked perfectly fine with ultra-high settings. Honestly, I'd be willing to say you could probably crank up the resolution and probably see a very similar frame rate. Probably something that seems a bit of an odd benchmark to include with Unreal Gold, given it runs on virtually every bit of hardware we've ever tested, but this was more just to test the driver-side enhancements to make sure they're all working in older titles. So I went through the drivers and turned on absolutely everything possible, so we've got EQ AA, we've got anisotropic filtering, we've got all of the enhancements available for older titles cranked up to the maximum. And they all worked and were applied absolutely fine here in Unreal Gold, which we were running in 1080p. So Unreal Gold works fine, and it does mean that for your older titles, chances are you're going to see it be completely compatible with perfect frame rates, and you can turn on some driver-side enhancements as well. It's a bit of an odd benchmark to include, but something I do like to test on newer hardware, just to see how it handles even the oldest of titles we usually include in older benchmarks. Just to take this idea even further, we have SimCity 4, which was running with default settings and 32-bit colours. Doesn't seem like something you'd be saying in a modern review, but here we are saying it. Now, SimCity 4 does have a good few problems launching on modern systems. It was a complete nightmare to get the game to launch on my laptop, but here with this AMD APU, well, backwards compatibility does seem to have been factored in a decent chunk, as there were no problems with it launching out of the box. Now, some people are going to comment that there's workaround and fixes and things for higher resolutions, but that's not necessarily what we're testing here. What we are testing is the fact that you can just double-click the .exe file from the game you've installed, and it will launch and it will run. Yes, you can probably use mods to make this better, but it's nice to know that you can at least play the game, or as I did, play it far too long, with just the settings you get out of the box. But finally, can AMD's 780M run Crysis? Well, it turns out yes, it can run it perfectly fine with 64 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 47 FPS. It's worth noting here, part of our high frame rate is thanks to that Ryzen processor being able to boost up 2 cores to 5 GHz to maintain over 60 FPS in a game that can only really utilize 2 cores. And even then, it's mostly just stressing one out more than the other. So Crysis looked and ran fantastic, which is nice to see, and a big selling point here, it launched in DirectX 10. Now I know there's workarounds and fixes that have come out and resolved this problem on a lot of cards, but do you know how nice it is not to have to use workarounds to be able to launch an older title on DirectX 10 and it just works flawlessly? So the overall gaming performance. Well, we've got to keep in mind that this is a bit of a budget system, especially with the sale it's on now, but my takeaway from the AMD Radeon 780M that's powering this PC is that's some really solid performance. I mean, across the board, the most popular titles out there are completely playable, and in my experience, the only game that I had real trouble with was Half-Life 2 RTX, which brings virtually every ray tracing capable card I've tested completely down to its knees. When it comes to the most popular titles out there, you're able to enjoy them in full HD with really good settings. I mean, sometimes you are better off capping the frame rate, and Cyberpunk and GTA 5 Enhanced Edition really were testament to that, let's be honest, because they had some odd frame pacing quirks, and I do think that is more down to the AMD drivers than this system itself, because the thermals checked out okay, the boost clocks were okay, and I have, for later on in the video, done some Linux testing which does confirm that it is probably the AMD drivers causing a few quirks here. But when it comes to the actual system working, you're talking 30 FPS with ray tracing in GTA 5 Enhanced, GTA 5 Legacy Edition nearly completely maxed out at over 60 FPS, and even GTA Online in its completely bloated and unoptimized state will still net you nearly 60 FPS when you've got people in the lobby. So the most popular titles out there work completely fine, and you aren't going to have to use low settings. I mean, even a title like Oblivion Remastered, yeah, we had to cap the frame rate, but we were still able to put a couple of options onto medium, and the game looked pretty good. So you have got things like FSR that do help, and admittedly we only used it in one title, which was Oblivion Remastered, but other than that, it was pretty much perfect performance across the board, even in older titles that usually sometimes don't even like starting on modern PCs, or sometimes have major problems and graphical glitches. SimCity 4, I've just tried to get that working on my Intel-based laptop, and it just wasn't happy. Here, I just installed it onto the PC, double-click the exe file, and you're good to go. To stray away from gaming for a brief second though, because as much as it is interesting to see the gaming side performance, the main way that you can let the system like this stretch its legs when it's processor really and actually do something, because in gaming it wasn't having to do all too much, it was the graphics card taking the brunt of the workload. Well, I did do some video editing, and the performance was pretty much stellar when we were testing just CPU side performance by itself. Now, some people will say, "Ooh, this isn't a very good benchmark because I'm going to be using, I don't know, what's the version, DaVinci Resolve and software like that, and I've got GPU encoding," and I think, that's fair enough, because stuff like that does work. I did run Handbrake and I did run OBS, and the AMD VCE encoder is fantastic for accelerating your workload. But Serif does offer something unique, which is an entirely, completely unoptimized x264 workload, because it does utilize all cores. You can use Serif Movie Plus, render out a 4K file like I usually do, and it will utilize all cores. But there's no graphics side acceleration, so we are really stressing out the processor here, and it also tests the boost capabilities really rather well, as certain effects in this software are very single-threaded, and depending on how high the system can boost, also changes the render speed. So in terms of actual rendering workloads, even if you are limited to just an x264 application, the PC was excellent, with it boosting up to 5 GHz when needed for single core effects. So when it comes to actual editing on the PC, it's more or less fantastic. It's also worth noting I did run a few tests on it with Audacity and OpenVINO just to test how it deals with AI-based workloads, and even though I don't think it's got any specifically dedicated hardware like an NPU I believe they're called, it did work fantastically fine. So even with just CPU rendering tasks, it had more than enough power to run AI-based workloads, which mostly for me is just noise reduction and noise removal because it's a fantastic feature, and it was done in seconds. It compiled the model and just ran away with it. So when it comes to actual video editing workloads, audio workloads, and AI workloads, it has more than enough power in reserve that it just worked completely fine. Now I can pretty much guarantee there is a question that I've left hanging for a while now, which was installing Linux on the system, because given how excellent the Windows performance was, and we are actually using a modern AMD APU, there may be some actual tangible benefit to running Linux in terms of graphics side performance. So I did run through an install of Bazzite, which went pretty smoothly overall, to be honest. There wasn't all too many problems. I had to reformat the hard drive using commands, but that's just because Windows was installed and it was having a few conflicts, and we were done with that in no time. So eventually we had everything up and running on Linux. Now, I'm not going to delve into how much smoother it was, because honestly, this system on Windows was completely fine. And when you move things over to Linux, maybe you could say it was ever so slightly snappier, maybe slightly, but honestly, the perceptible difference in performance between Windows and Linux, there wasn't really any there. So when it comes to choosing an operating system you might want to run on a PC like this, Windows or Linux, if it's just general day-to-day tasks, well, you're not really going to notice much of a difference. I will say all the drivers work absolutely fine here on Linux, at least on the Bazzite version that I tested, so it's nice to see that you can at least use Linux straight out of the box and it will work fine. But the thing is, people actually want to know how does it perform in gaming over on Linux, and I did go through and do a little bit of testing, and there wasn't a huge deal of difference, to be honest. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition didn't suffer from the same frame rate issues it had on Windows, so you could leave the frame rate uncapped and enjoy the same sort of frame times as if you had left it capped, so it was slightly better on Linux. GTA 5 Legacy was slightly better on Windows. BeamNG, I think there's probably about 1 frame per second difference between the two of them, but both of them are utilizing Vulkan nowadays. Cyberpunk ran better on Linux, but only by slightly, not enough to actually make any difference. And Black Mesa was actually smoother on Windows than it was here on Linux, and that's because we could use DirectX 9, whereas here we are forced into using the Vulkan version. Counter-Strike 2 was ever so slightly better on Windows than it is on Linux, but this is a commonly documented problem. Still, both were very playable and you really wouldn't notice when you're actually playing the game. Rust ran better on Windows, and so did Baldur's Gate 3. Generally though, when I'm saying Windows works better, we are talking about 2 to 3 FPS at most, and very similar frame times overall. So yes, you can use it for Linux gaming, but it'll only be better on a case-by-case basis. So we know performance seems to work absolutely fine over on Linux, it works absolutely fine on Windows, and the performance overall is stellar. But how does it actually work as a device? Just how are things in terms of power consumption and thermals? Well, if we start off with thermals first, we can see that the maximum temperature we saw overall was 90 degrees Celsius. And this is something I've seen echoed in a few other reviews and other GEEKOM PCs, but given that they send these things to me and I will actively use these for over a week to get figures and performance numbers, I can tell you that after 1 week using the device, well, performance does actually get dramatically better. I mean, I know it only sounds like a 4-degree difference, but given this was under a peak boost load, the exact same test done a week later after I'd used it for a week, thermals had improved. I don't know what type of thermal paste they use in these mini PCs. I've done a teardown before, the build quality's been excellent, but it does seem like it needs time to set. And usually within a week's time, your thermals do actually improve. In terms of other temperature readings though, your gaming average was under 70 degrees, video editing was pretty much bang on 70 degrees while I was doing it, a sustained full load running Furmark and the CPU-Z stress test resulted in 81 degrees, media streaming, think videos and things like that, you're talking just north of ambient at 34 degrees, and when it came to idle, it was just on 27, which is ever so slightly warmer than ambient. So I'd say overall thermal performance seems really rather decent, just give it a week for that thermal paste to set. When it comes to power consumption, which of course is quite important for these mini PCs, especially given that they could be used in offices, under TVs, just a device that hardly uses any power, I have to say that it was remarkably power efficient, utilising 62 watts under a peak burst load measured from the wall, with gaming coming in at just north of 40 watts. Video editing, of course not utilising the graphics card whatsoever, was under 36 watts, and a sustained full load on both the CPU and GPU when boost clocks had stopped running and it was just a constant flat speed from both the CPU and the GPU, we saw 51 watts. Media streaming was pretty ideal at 16 watts, and at idle our consumption was about 8 watts, which is really impressive to see. So power consumption is fairly good across the board, it's not going to cost much to run this, and is actually one of the reasons why I still use one of these mini PCs, because when it comes to power consumption, well, they seem to be about the best you can get. So there we have it, the Radeon 780M reviewed in the GEEKOM A8. And once again, thank you to GEEKOM for sending this mini PC over for me to review. Honestly, it's pretty great working with them because they will just send these to me and let me go ham on testing the hardware. I can go and test SimCity 4, I can test Tomb Raider, I can throw up against GTA 5 with ray tracing, and it just lets me make a really comprehensive modern review of modern hardware that is in these mini PCs, because I still use my GEEKOM mini PCs for editing, and they've been fantastic, so I think in terms of durability and reliability, you're pretty much going to be bang up fine. So if you are interested in one of these, as I said, they've got their 22nd anniversary sale going on. There'll be some links in the description. If they haven't sent me over, I'll whack some down there anyway, just so you can go and check them out. But I think that's some really solid performance just from the 780M chip and that Ryzen processor. It's quite impressive just how far we've come in the world of APUs. And this is a chip that's now a couple of years old, so once again, thank you to GEEKOM, thank you all for watching. I hope you found this informative. Mostly when I test these things, they're not so much challenges as much as they are just really in-depth informative reviews, so you can try and gauge for yourself on how you think the performance is, but I'm pretty blown away by it, so thank you all very much for watching, and good night.